Salerno, Italy, September 9, 1943. 4 a.m. The air was thick with the brine of the Tyrrhenian Sea and the acrid smoke of naval gunfire. Not a storm, but war. The deep guttural sound of naval artillery was the overture to the invasion, a terrifying symphony played by the guns of the Allied fleet. For the thousands of American and British troops crammed into the landing craft, the darkness offered little comfort, only the metallic taste of fear and the deafening roar that vibrated in their chests. This was Operation Avalanche, the invasion of the Italian mainland, and it was quickly devolving into a bloody, close-run disaster. At the center of this maelstrom, standing on the bridge of the USS Ancon, was Lieutenant General Mark Wayne Clark. 47 years old, impeccably dressed and radiating a confidence bordering on arrogance, Clark was the quintessential American general, ambitious, demanding, and supremely self-assured. He commanded the American Fifth Army, the spearhead of the Allied thrust up the boot of Italy. His objective was clear: seize the port of Naples and push north to secure the airfields that would threaten Hitler's southern flank. Yet even as the landing craft scraped the beaches, a historical irony began to unfold, an irony that would define Clark's legacy and breed a deep, festering resentment. The Allies, in their haste to invade, had underestimated the ferocity of the German response, led by the brilliant tactician Field Marshal Albert Kesselring. Within days, the beachhead was imperiled. German armored divisions counterattacked with brutal efficiency, threatening to drive the entire Fifth Army back into the sea. This was not a quick liberation. It was a desperate fight for survival. The central contradiction of Mark Clark's command begins here. A general focused on glory, thrust into a grinding, brutal war of attrition. He was a man obsessed with being the first to enter Rome, the first to break the line. But the topography of Italy, that unforgiving, mountainous spine of the Apennines, dictated that this would be a war of inches, not leaps. The terrain itself was the German ally, turning every valley into a killing ground and every ridge into a fortress. "We were fighting two enemies," one Allied soldier would later recount: the Germans, who were ruthless, and the terrain, which was impossible. Clark wanted us to charge headlong into a landscape designed for defense. Clark's response to the crisis at Salerno was telling. He was famously seen risking his life under fire, walking among the beleaguered troops, a theatrical display of courage. But beneath the bravery lay a deep-seated frustration. He was a corps commander who suddenly found himself commanding a multinational army on the brink of collapse, and his command style, often abrasive, dismissive of British competence, and intensely focused on personal success, began to alienate his peers and his own subordinates. The strategic stakes were enormous. Our collapse at Salerno would have been catastrophic for the entire Mediterranean strategy. Winston Churchill himself admitted, "One more such battle, and we are finished." Clark's Fifth Army did hold, narrowly, but the cost was immense. Over 12,000 Allied casualties in just the first 9 days. This grim tally introduced the Italian population to the brutal reality of their liberation. The advance was secured not by maneuver and cunning, but by sheer overwhelming firepower and American industrial muscle. The logistical machine behind the Fifth Army was staggering. Hundreds of thousands of tons of supplies, shells, fuel, food, poured onto the beaches, a physical manifestation of the industrial power that Hitler had fatally underestimated. The men who survived Salerno would soon understand that the path north towards the prize of Rome was a corridor of unimaginable suffering. For the Italian civilians caught between the retreating Germans, who employed scorched-earth tactics and summary executions, and the advancing, often indiscriminate Allied artillery, there was no easy choice. They saw Clark not as a savior, but as the architect of destruction who had brought the industrial slaughterhouse to their ancient land. The stage was set for the most controversial chapter of Clark's career. The initial suspense, the nail-biting survival at Salerno, gave way to a deeper, more profound historical mystery. How could the man credited with securing the key beachhead in Italy become a figure of such lasting derision? The answer lay buried not just in strategic blunders, but in a profound failure of understanding the human cost of his ambition. If the story of General Mark Clark's controversial command on the Italian front intrigues you, be sure to hit that subscribe button. We'll be diving deep into the technical and strategic failures at the Winter Line in our next chapter. The Gustav Line, Central Italy, October 1943. The euphoria of surviving Salerno quickly dissipated as the Allied armies slammed head-on into the reality of Kesselring's defensive genius, the Winter Line. This was not a hastily assembled defense, but a masterpiece of military engineering, a labyrinth of interconnected defenses anchored by the formidable Gustav Line. It stretched from the Tyrrhenian Sea to the Adriatic, utilizing the rugged Apennine terrain to its maximum advantage. If Clark saw Italy as a path to glory, Kesselring saw it as a tactical killing field. The German strategy was simple and devastatingly effective. Delay, inflict maximum casualties and bleed the Allies white, diverting crucial resources away from the inevitable landing in France. The Allied war machine, accustomed to the fast mechanized warfare of North Africa, was paralyzed by the mountain geometry. Every hill was a German observation post, every stone farmhouse a bunker. The key to the entire defense, the very heart of the Gustav Line, was the town of Cassino and the ancient Benedictine monastery that sat sentinel on the mountain peak above it. This is where the second major contradiction of Clark's command emerged. Clark was a student of maneuver warfare, yet he was forced into a siege. His temperament, always inclined towards the aggressive, chafed against the grinding pace. He needed to break the line, and his urgency led to a cascade of tactical blunders that cost thousands of lives. The Fifth Army's objective was to capture the Liri Valley, the only clear, flat route to Rome. But to get there, they had to crack the anchor point, Cassino. A German engineer captured later remarked, "We only had to dig and wait. The Americans did the rest. They attacked where the ground favored us most. It was a gift." The attempts to breach the Gustav Line, from the brutal waterlogged crossings of the Volturno River to the bloody fiasco at the Rapido River, showcased Clark's relentless and often strategically unsound determination. The crossing of the Rapido, a freezing, swift-flowing tributary, remains one of the darkest stains on his record. Clark ordered the U.S. 36th Infantry Division to cross the river into a prepared German killing zone. The division was practically annihilated. The technical specifics of the German defense were chillingly precise. They utilized pre-sighted heavy artillery, including the massive 170mm K-18 cannons and the infamous Nebelwerfer rocket launchers, nicknamed Screaming Mimes by the GIs for their terrifying sound. These weapons were zeroed in on every potential crossing point and assembly area, making any forward movement a death sentence. Allied casualties soared to alarming levels. The 1st Special Service Force, nicknamed the Devil's Brigade, performed heroic feats, but their sacrifices were often in vain against the density of the German defenses. The irony was acute. The most technologically and industrially powerful army in the world was being stalled by trenches, mud, and terrain. American factories were producing aircraft like the P-47 Thunderbolt and tanks like the M4 Sherman at unheard-of rates. Statistics that demonstrated an industrial scale unmatched in history. Yet here, a single German machine gun nest could hold up an entire battalion. Clark's focus became singular, breaking the stalemate. The pressure was immense. Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight D. Eisenhower was demanding progress. The eyes of the world were on Rome. The desperation led to the controversial decision to bomb the historic Monte Cassino Abbey in February 1944. Clark initially opposed the bombing, understanding the disastrous propaganda and moral ramifications. However, under pressure from corps commanders who were convinced the Germans were using the Abbey as an observation post, he reluctantly acquiesced. The site of the ancient sacred structure, reduced to rubble by thousands of pounds of American bombs, specifically 2,250 LBS blockbuster bombs, was a psychological turning point. The bombing was a moral failure and, critically, a tactical blunder. The destruction of the monastery not only provided the Germans with better rubble defenses, but solidified the perception among the Italians. The Allies were indifferent to their culture, their history, and their lives. The hope of quick liberation was replaced by the horror of total war. For the Italian people, this was not just an attack on a building, it was an attack on the soul of Italy, and General Mark Clark was the name on the order. The suspense was now terrifying. With the heart of the Gustav Line shattered but still unbroken, how would Clark justify the immense cost? And what desperate maneuver would he attempt next to achieve his ultimate, driving ambition, to be the one to march into Rome? Anzio, Italy, January 22, 1944. Stalemated at Cassino, the Allied High Command devised a daring, some would say reckless plan, Operation Shingle, a surprise amphibious landing at Anzio behind the Gustav Line intended to cut German supply lines and force Kesselring to withdraw his forces from the main front. It was the strategic dagger thrust Clark had been waiting for. The landing itself was initially successful. The German response was sluggish. The door to Rome was briefly ajar. The irony of Anzio, and the great controversy surrounding Clark's direct involvement, lies in what happened next. General John P. Lucas, commanding the troops ashore, was overly cautious. He secured the beachhead and dug in, fearing a counterattack. Kesselring, initially shocked, realized the opportunity Lucas presented and raced to surround the lightly defended perimeter. Within days, Anzio was not a dagger at the German throat, but a trapped fist. A massive historical irony. The Allies had surprised the Germans, only to surprise themselves by their own timidity. Clark, the overall commander of the operation, bore the ultimate responsibility for the execution and the subsequent failure to exploit the initial advantage. His directive to Lucas was notoriously vague, emphasizing both the need to secure the beachhead and to advance on Rome. Lucas chose the former. The Anzio beachhead became a living hell, a tiny 15 by 17-mile cauldron relentlessly shelled by German artillery. These included the massive 280mm K5E railway guns, nicknamed Anzio Annie, whose shells struck with the force of small earthquakes. The statistics of the beachhead are staggering, an average of 1,200 Allied casualties per week for 4 long months. Life in the beachhead was reduced to a primal struggle against fear, mud, and the constant crushing knowledge that the enemy could observe and shell every single position. "We were fighting a static war on a dynamic front," recalled a British officer at Anzio. "Every morning was a game of Russian roulette. We were supposed to be the mobile force, but we were just cannon fodder." Clark's presence and decision-making during the Anzio crisis were intensely scrutinized. His relationship with the British commanders, already strained, fractured further. The British saw Clark as overly focused on American prestige. Clark, in turn, often blamed the British for perceived failures. The command structure was a toxic mix of ambition, mistrust, and national rivalry. The suspense was palpable. Could the beachhead hold? Would the Germans succeed in driving the Allies back into the sea, a disaster that would dwarf Salerno? The relentless German counterattacks in February nearly achieved this goal. Clark was forced to commit every possible reserve, diverting men and resources desperately needed for the ongoing, brutal battles at Cassino. It was a stalemate of immense sacrifice, a testament to German resilience and the lethal nature of the Italian terrain. The ultimate goal of the entire Italian campaign, Operation Diadem, the final massive push to break the Gustav Line, was launched in May 1944, a strategy that would finally free the forces at Anzio. The plan was a coordinated effort by multiple Allied armies, leveraging overwhelming fire superiority and a massive concentration of force. Clark's American Fifth Army was assigned the western flank and the final push toward the Liri Valley. But as the main battle raged, Clark's deeper ambition began to cloud his strategic judgment. The objective assigned by General Harold Alexander, the overall ground commander, was to pin down and destroy the German 10th Army. This was the key strategic goal: eliminate German fighting power. But for Mark Clark, the opportunity was too great. Rome, the symbolic, psychological, and historical prize, was now within reach. The obsession with being the first American to enter the Eternal City became his singular focus, a personal quest for glory that would override the collective strategic goal. And in this act of turning his focus, the seeds of enduring historical condemnation were fully sown. Liri Valley, Italy. Late May 1944, the immense coordinated power of Operation Diadem finally cracked the Gustav Line. The sacrifice was horrific, but the strategic goal was being achieved. The German 10th Army was retreating, attempting to escape encirclement. It was at this critical juncture, the moment of potential strategic victory, that General Mark Clark made the decision that cemented his negative legacy among his peers and arguably cost the lives of thousands of Allied soldiers and Italian civilians. General Alexander's battle plan called for the American Fifth Army to pivot left-northwest after breaching the German defenses, trapping the retreating 10th Army against the advancing British 8th Army. The execution of this pincer movement, known as the Anvil, would have resulted in the virtual destruction of the main German fighting force in Italy. It would have meant a faster end to the Italian campaign. Clark, however, saw the open road to Rome. Irony of the turn. Instead of swinging left to pursue the retreating German army, Clark ordered his forces, specifically the Sixth Corps, now broken out from Anzio, to pivot right, northeast, directly toward Rome. Alexander told me to get the German 10th Army, Clark would later write in his memoirs, justifying his decision. But Rome was the great prize. I was not going to let the British take it. It was an American achievement. This decision was not just a minor deviation, it was a profound strategic betrayal. By prioritizing the symbolic conquest of Rome over the destruction of the enemy army, Clark allowed the bulk of the German 10th Army, Kesselring's main force, to escape north. The Anvil closed on air, and Kesselring was given the precious time he needed to establish a new defensive line, the Gothic Line, prolonging the war in Italy by another 9 agonizing months. The technological aspect of the escape is crucial. The Germans, masters of the strategic withdrawal, utilized the superior infrastructure of the Apennine roads and the efficiency of their specialized transport units. They were masters of demolitions, destroying bridges and tunnels behind them, further slowing the pursuit. The consequences of Clark's ambition were immediate and devastatingly clear. 1. Prolonged war. The successful escape of the German forces meant the Allies would face the equally formidable Gothic Line, leading to another winter of brutal mountain warfare and thousands more casualties. 2. Increased Italian suffering. The prolonged fighting meant more months of bombardment, displacement, and the horrific continuation of German anti-partisan and scorched earth tactics, including massacres like the Ardeatine Caves, often perpetrated in the wake of the Allied advance. The Italian population, who had hoped the fall of Rome meant the end of the war in their country, were tragically disappointed. Rome, Italy, June 4, 1944. Clark achieved his ambition. He was indeed the first to enter Rome, riding in triumph in his jeep. The scene was cinematic, the celebration rapturous. But history's judgment on this moment is complex. The headlines hailed the American victory, but the strategic reality was a failure. The city was captured, but the enemy escaped. While the world celebrated the fall of the First Axis capital, the German 10th Army was already digging in hundreds of miles north. For the Allied soldiers fighting up the rest of the boot, Clark's glory felt hollow. A young American lieutenant, fighting north of Rome, captured the sentiment perfectly. We took Rome, and all we got was another mountain range to climb, and the same damn Germans waiting for us. Clark got his parade. We got more dying. For the Italians, the perception of Clark changed from a potentially aloof liberator to a destructive egoist. They saw the price of his ambition in the rubble of Cassino and the delayed peace. They hated him not for incompetence, but for his colossal vanity, which they believed prolonged their suffering. The moral weight of the bombing of Cassino, combined with the strategic diversion to seize Rome, created the lasting, deep-seated animosity. The American industrial might had secured a city, but the personal ambition of its general had betrayed the strategic intent. The story now leads to the final act, the brutal confrontation with the Gothic Line and the final enduring legacy of Mark Clark. The final stage of the Italian campaign was perhaps the most brutal. Kesselring, utilizing the mountainous terrain of the northern Apennines, constructed the Gothic Line, a defensive barrier as formidable as the Gustav Line, running from the coast south of La Spezia to the Adriatic. The failure to encircle the German 10th Army meant the Allies had to fight a grinding attritional war over some of the most difficult terrain in Europe. The sheer scale of the fighting was immense. The Allies, commanded by Clark after Alexander was promoted, poured unprecedented resources into the effort. The logistical demands were astronomical, with thousands of tons of ammunition expended to inch forward against the determined German defense. The fighting was characterized by brutal small-unit actions in the mountains, a war of bayonets, grenades, and constant patrol clashes. The famous 10th Mountain Division, trained for Alpine warfare, was finally deployed, but even their specialized skills could only mitigate, not prevent, the inevitable casualties. Mark Clark's role in this final phase was less controversial strategically, but the resentment toward him remained. His tendency to micromanage, his harsh critiques of subordinate commanders, and his continued focus on American primacy continued to chafe against the reality of a multinational effort. The entire narrative arc, the irony of Clark's ambition versus the terrain's dictates, is proven by the campaign's conclusion. The war in Italy did not end with a brilliant maneuver masterminded by Clark. It ended with the total collapse of the German war machine in Europe in May 1945, long after the great victories had been secured on the Western Front. The Italian campaign became the Forgotten Front, a strategic sideshow largely overshadowed by D-Day and the push into Germany. The legacy of Mark Clark is defined by two indelible facts. 1. He won the war in Italy. His leadership secured the Salerno beachhead, his forces broke the Gustav Line, and he led the advance that eventually defeated the German armies in the theater. His operational victories are undeniable. 2. He prolonged the war for personal glory. His decision to prioritize the capture of Rome over the strategic destruction of the German 10th Army ensured the war in Italy dragged on for months longer than necessary, inflicting needless suffering on the Allied soldiers and the Italian population. This contradiction is the heart of the Italian animosity. For the Italians, Clark was the general who promised liberation but delivered devastation. The bombing of Cassino, the unnecessary destruction to secure a political prize, and the prolonged presence of war on their soil due to strategic vanity became the basis for their enduring hatred. Final reflection. Decades after the war, General Clark would visit Italy and be confronted by survivors. He remained defiant, always arguing that the capture of Rome was a necessary political and morale booster. But for the average Italian civilian, the memory of his triumphant drive through Rome was forever tainted by the sounds of artillery still booming on the northern mountains. Mark Wayne Clark, the ambitious and capable commander, remains one of the most polarizing figures of the Second World War. He won his war and secured his place in history, but he did so at a cost to others that they, and history itself, have never quite forgiven. His story is a powerful reminder that in war, the pursuit of personal glory can often lead to a betrayal of strategic necessity and, most tragically, an extension of human suffering. The irony is profound. The man who liberated Italy from the Axis became, for many of its people, a symbol of the destructive, self-serving nature of the war itself. Thank you for watching. If this deep dive into the untold controversies of World War II's Italian campaign resonated with you, please subscribe and leave a comment below telling us which controversial commander you'd like us to explore next.